All right. Hi, Paul Khuong. I wrote about this blog post about how you could apply LZ77. It's a compression algorithm for strings and use it in a compilation context. Today I want to talk about something that's kind of more fundamental, which is why would you want to do that? So first, I think the first thing to do is what are traces? So here's a program in your loop. On your left. So this is your typical basic program. You see print hi, then the next statement is goes back to the previous statement. The corresponding trace would be just history of what the program did. So for instance, here would be an endless sequence of print hi. And what's interesting about program traces is that compiling them is super easy and really fun. So all sorts of interesting analyses and transformation that are really hard in general become trivial, not trivial, but simple, like polynomial time, even linear time usually, once you're working with program traces or expression trees if you swing that way. So there's a general reason for that. Basically, dynamic programming always works, but that's getting awful close to my thesis topic, so let's move on. So my dream compiler would be something like you feed in a program, you enumerate all the possible traces, all the possible execution traces for that program. You run your magic on the traces, so you make it super tight, and then you compress everything back into object code. Sadly, that can't work, if only because the number of traces is very large, often pretty much infinite. So we spend a lot of time in the first step. So one way to think about general compilation passes is that you kind of try to swap the compression and the magic phases so that something's not in morphism. And you get expand, compress, and they sort of annihilate one another, and you're left with a souped-up version of your magic transformation pass. So that is cool. Sadly, I don't see how to do that in general, and it's a lot of hard work. What if instead we could kind of brute force our way through that? So if you take your typical recursive function, f here, and you want to make it quicker, what's the easiest way? You just increase the size of your base case. So for instance, here you could say, well, all right, I'm doing f calls f calls f. Instead, I could just kind of squish together the bottom two levels. I get program trace, do some magic on that, make it a lot quicker, and call that f prime. And now instead of having f calls f calls f, I have f calls f prime that is super quick. So hopefully the whole program will be a lot quicker as well. So yeah, this only works for recursion. If you try to do it on loops or tail recursion, you will fail. But that's fine. Also, it only works on micro benchmarks. So what happens is that you would take this tiny recursive definition, like 10 lines of code, and you would turn it into something like a dozen or 100 kilobytes of machine code, and that's going to blow your instruction cache. Everything will be slow unless the only thing you do in your program is, say, run matrix multiplications. Not practical. And yet, I mean, clearly there's some structure here. You had a very small program and you generated a huge output from it, so there must be some redundancy. So I tried some stuff there, like try to identify loops. Sadly, what happened is that mostly you would find loops with exactly 2 iterations, not very useful, not a lot of compression either. Could also try to find duplicated patches and turn that into subroutines. That worked kind of-ish, but you'd often get kind of conflicts between patches so that you get subroutines, but you would kind of have hidden away the rest of the redundancies, so you would not get interesting subroutines. And that was pretty much where I got stuck about 5 years ago, until one morning this March, as I was going through the RSS feed for archive, as one does in the morning, I stumbled on this preprint by Arthur Jazz, which is called a really simple approximation of smallest grammar. So in that paper, what Jazz tries to do is you take a string and you want to convert it into a very tiny grammar, as small as possible. So the basic way to do it would be to say, well, take your first string here, it's A, B, C, D, A, B, F, and you just pair terminals to get new non-terminals. So here you have this first pair, A, B, call that G. Then second pair, CD, call that F. And then third pair, AB. Oh, hey, I've seen this before. This is still G, finally F. And now you get a smaller string with a mix of terminals and non-terminals, GH, GF, and you do that again. So that's kind of interesting because if you go back to program traces, you can say, well, non-terminals or letters are actually statements, VM of code, machine instructions. Sorry, that's terminals. Then when you create new production rules, that's a new subroutine. And when you have non-terminals, that's actually a call to your subroutine. However, doing this naively, just pairing stuff as you see them, doesn't always work. So for instance, here you have ABC, ABC, DA. So in theory, there's some redundancy here, repeated ADC, ABC. And yet, if you pair things, you just get AB, CA, BC, DA, and there is not a single repetition there. Not cool. So what Jess says is, well, you know what? We have really good algorithms to find redundant patches and strings. LZ77, that LZ77 is a very good one. It's also very simple. And what it does is it tries to describe a string in terms of what you've seen before. So if you have ABC, ABC, you would describe it as ABC and a back reference of line 3 starting at A. So that's kind of like a function call. You have ABC, you define a new function, and rather than repeating ABC, you just call that function that emits ABC. You can also do loops. So you have DE, DE, DE. Well, what happens is you actually emit DE, and then you copy that for a length of 4 characters. That's kind of strange. I only have 2 characters, and I just cut it for just 4. What happens is you basically end up reading what you just wrote before. So that's a, that's a repeat loop. So yeah, you could try to take your LZ77 compression or factorization, as they call it, and turn it into a program. Sadly, that does not work because the traces, the patches that you refer to may themselves be generated by mixing multiple patches together and nothing nests correctly, and you're screwed. So what Jess says is, all right, so we cannot use the factorization directly, but we can use it as an oracle to help us determine when we should not pair characters or codes to create new subroutines. So what you do is you find your factorization and you pair things up, except when that would break into another factor. So if you have ABC, ABC, you would do, all right, I'm going to pair AB, call that D. C, I cannot pair that with the next character because it's a different patch. So I'll just leave it alone. Then you start again, like AB, all right, that's D again, and then C. So the nice thing here is that you got some redundancy, and even better, you preserved it, so you can do it again, because now ABC has become DC, DC. So you do that until finally you get a single subroutine call. So Jess does a lot of work to show how it's within a factor of log n of optimal, but I'm not concerned with that. What I want to do is use it on real programs. So here's what happens when you try to draw something in PostScript and you don't know for loops. So you have this line that draws a square, and you just repeat it 8 times to have this ring of squares. So let's see what happens when I push that into my program to see if it could find redundancy. And yes, it does. It has factored my 157 token program into 58 plus 14 curly braces that don't really count. So the only sad thing here is that it doesn't really make sense. Like it found a loop, but the loop is kind of weirdly rotated. You can see that it ends by pushing something to the stack. But yeah. So to summarize, if you have nothing to do on a rainy day, consider optimizing traces. It's really fun. Instead of being uber hard, it's just a nice logic puzzle. And compression is basically about finding hidden structure and works even in program code. Thank you.